Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, Shaykhna.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Thank you for joining me for another discussion on Back to Basics.
No problem at all. It's my pleasure.
With the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we were able to extend our discussion of evil and the arguments posed by atheists in regards to the whole discussion of does good and evil exist.
Yes.
One argument I came across recently was the idea of the evil God. Now, are you able to explain to our viewers what their argument is? And
certainly. Well, I thank you for giving me the opportunity to cover this as a whole episode. I do warn the viewers that there will be a degree of repetition. We will be covering some of the facts that we have previously gone over in order to show that this argument is fallacious at best. But nonetheless, I do think it was a somewhat witty attempt by the atheists to maintain a decent argument for refuting God's existence. I do think it will fail for numerous of reasons we mentioned previously, but nonetheless, just to give a context for some of the arguments used in what we call the evil God argument, we'll see that they go as follows. Number one, when theists argue for the existence of God, they give forward many different arguments. So for example, traditionally Muslim scholars as well as Western philosophers working within the philosophy of religion, again, just to include a caveat, because I know that this video will be reviewed and I don't want the reviewer to misunderstand what we're saying here. When we talk about the philosophy of religion, we're not talking about Ishraqi philosophy. We're not talking about Sadrian philosophy. We're not talking about the philosophy which is considered to be heretical within the Hausa. We are talking about philosophy as in a love of wisdom, questions about rationality and its relationship to external concepts. When we look at the philosophy of religion, we see that arguments in order to demonstrate the existence of God have been classified into numerous different types of arguments. For example, you would find that we have what's called the cosmological argument. The cosmological argument would be that everything which begins must have a cause out with itself or in itself. The universe came into existence at a point, therefore the universe has a cause which is external to it. That's a cosmological argument, or what's called the kalam cosmological argument. Then we have other types of arguments such as the teleological arguments, that this universe shows the features of beautiful design and it seems to be well crafted by an architect, therefore it has someone that designed it. This is known as a teleological argument or a design argument. Then we have other arguments such as the argument from objective morality, that if objective morality exists, then God exists. That's a moral argument. The argument for evil God goes like this. When we look at an argument, for example, the Kalam cosmological argument, this argument itself tells us nothing about the moral nature of God. So the argument goes like this. Because the Christian, the Muslim, the Jew, the deist, they will all cite the cosmological argument, namely that whatever comes into existence must have a cause. The universe did come into existence, therefore the universe has a cause, and that cause is God. The atheist says, well, hang on a minute. This argument tells me nothing about the moral nature of that God. So they say, in the same way that you think it's reasonable for me to believe that the creator of this universe is a good God, let me turn the tables on you and say to you, no. How about I put forward the hypothesis that the creator of this universe was not a good God, but rather was an evil God. Now, of course, they come prepared, so what they say is, in the same way that when I show you the problem of evil, and you have a decent explanation for it, like the explanations I tried to give the other day, of how God might have justifiable reasons for allowing evil, they say that, look, I know that you're going to tell me that how's it an evil God when there's so much good on the face of the earth? Why is there charity? Why is there all this decent stuff around? Surely that goes against the nature of the evil God. They'll say in the same way that you say to me, that good God has justifiable reasons for allowing evil, I'll say to you that evil God has good reasons for justifying a tiny degree of good in order to allow people to do the maximal evil possible. And so the argument is put forward like this. Now, some of us might be thinking, well, that's a bit stupid. Why are you putting forward an evil God argument in order for us to believe in atheism? Well, it goes a bit deeper than that. The argument goes like this. In the same way that you as an intelligent person, when hearing the argument about evil God, will know that whilst it's a justifiable hypothesis, it's false and I reject it. It carries the same weight and evidence as the hypothesis for a good God. So in the same way that you can easily reject the evil God hypothesis, I reject both the good God and evil God hypothesis as being false. Do you understand the argument?
Yeah.
So that's the argument that's put forward. So the argument is, just to summarize once more, just as you have put forward arguments for a good God that tell us little about the moral nature of that God, and you expect me to believe in it, why is it that if I were to put forward arguments for evil God, you wouldn't believe in it, but they carry the same weight in terms of how strong the argument is? If this is the case, then I as an atheist shouldn't have to accept your good God argument because it's a mirror reflection of the evil God argument, which you don't accept.
Or you can have a null hypothesis of God being neither good nor evil.
Well, you could, but I think what they're trying to show is that just like you put forward an argument for a God who's good and you expect me to believe in it, why is it that the God who's evil, which is just as probable as the God who's good from an argument perspective, you reject? If you're free to reject one of them, we should be free to reject both. Now, the massive problem with this argument is, as we defined in the first episode and looking at good and evil, good is something which is irreducibly basic. Namely, it exists in and of itself and it doesn't depend upon evil. Whereas evil, as we said in the first episode, according to the vast majority of philosophers, is not something that exists in a vacuum. There's no such thing as pure evil. Rather, what we have is evil which feeds upon good. Without the concept of good, there would be no such thing as evil, because evil is merely the absence of good. So in order for you to formulate an argument in which God is evil, well, what's he detracting from the good of? The only solution we could have for that is if there would be two gods, one would be good and one would be evil. And of course, that's absurd, because if there was two gods, we wouldn't witness the harmony and unity that we have within the universe. Rather, we would witness destruction and things constantly in a level of dualistic opposition, which is something that we don't witness. So that's first of all. Second of all, let's take a look at this argument once more. He's saying, just because two beliefs carry the same level of weight in terms of evidence and are equally as plausible, it means that we can suggest that they're on the same footing. Well, I reject this entirely. I don't believe that two equally valid beliefs in terms of evidence are on the same footing. Let me give you an example. Remember when we were discussing the street epistemologists, and we said that they said that you could never have faith in anything, and it's not a good way to ascertain belief. Well, I said that I have faith in my intellect's ability to trust things, and that I'm not a brain in a vat. Well, the hypothesis that I am Yahya Seymour, I am actually 31 years old, my memories are my memories, that there is an external world around me, is just as valid as the hypothesis that Yahya Seymour is a computer-simulated program, a computer-simulated brain in a vat, which was created yesterday and given an illusion that was made to seem as if he's 31 years old, and as if there's external material around him like Hassan Naib, like the Imam Hussein TV studio. Yet, I would never suggest that just because this belief is equally valid in terms of evidence, that they're equally valid for me to hold. Obviously, the latter belief isn't going to help me very much in life, is it?
No, absolutely.
So, that's another good reason for us to reject this fallacious argument. And of course, the primary other reasons to reject this fallacious argument is let's kind of take this by the horns and roll with it. Let's say that there's a God who is perfectly evil, and evil is part of his nature. Well, would he consider evil to be good then, or would he consider it to be evil? And I think that's a dilemma which has not been addressed by atheists like Stephen Law, who did formulate this argument. Number two, evil God is so fond of evil, wouldn't he just torture himself and kind of do lots of evil things to himself if evil's intrinsically part of his nature? So what I mean by that is, even according to our conception of theism, there's a time in which God exists without anything else existing. Namely, as the narration states, there was God and nothing was with him. Likewise, since this universe does have a beginning, we can conceive that evil God, if he were to exist, existed at a period of time before anything else.
Before the story of Genesis.
Yeah. So, no, not before the story of Genesis, before the story of anything. Before everything conceivable, anything external to him. At that time, who was he facilitating his evil desires against? Was it himself? And if his nature is to be purely evil, wouldn't that mean he would just destroy himself? Because that would be the most evil thing you could do. If you want to think about maximally evil things to do, then I think the most maximally evil thing that could be done is to just remove existence from the realm of existence by making it nothingness. And so the most evil thing he could do is to just destroy himself, really.
And we're always taught, or the way we look at this world is created as a mercy for us. So,
and indeed, I think this is the other area where we must say that indeed we don't see the signs of an evil God. Now, when they argue that, look, let's, in the same way that theists will say that God has good reasons for allowing evil and suffering, well, let's look at it. If we were to put a percentage on how much of the world is evil and suffering, to be quite frank with you, the percentage which goes into natural evil, and what I mean by natural evil is earthquakes, tsunamis, famine, things which human beings can't stop because they're natural. When we look at the percentage of that in comparison to the mercy that we see all around us, I would say it's ridiculously outweighed by the mercy. So, for example, you and I, as a species, were it not for the mercy of God, we would not be here today. You and I have pathetic skin. We can't survive cold atmospheres like other animals. Our eyesight at nighttime is pathetic. Had we literally been placed in the most harshest of Darwinian circumstances, wild animals would have finished us off yesterday. And yet, look at what we've been able to achieve. Look at the world that we've built around us. It's very clear to me that we are not looking at the very problematic concept of evil God universe. It's very clear to me that there's no justification for saying that there's a minimal amount of good that we have to justify, but overall the world is evil. There's absolutely zero justification for it. And more importantly than that, given that Stephen Law is an atheist, I think, again, when we talk about good and evil, this brings us back to that conversation about objective morality. On what is he grounding the concept of good and evil? And I know that some people can say, well, I believe in it. Well, of course you believe in it, because we believe that God has placed within you a fitrah, which allows you to understand good and evil. But I want you to provide, on the account of atheism, an ability to explain away objective good and objective evil. And I personally believe that until someone is able to do so, that they fail to even enter into the conversation on what is good and what is evil when it comes to God.
Absolutely. And this partially covers the argument that you had in the beginning in terms of whether the creation or what we see around us is the product of cause and effect, when in reality we argue it's not, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the universe with a purpose.
Of course.
Now, given with good and evil in mind, what could we argue to be this purpose of creation?
That the purpose of creation is to serve Allah. And of course, to serve Allah is to be a good human being. It means to not harm anyone who's innocent. And it means to carry out the justice of Allah upon earth. Now what we see is that the Shara, when applied properly, not applied in the disgusting way that we see done by these pseudo-Islamic groups like ISIS, Daesh, the Taliban and other disgusting heretical groups, we see when applied decently is something which brings liberation for humanity. It brings them into a relationship with Allah Azza wa Jal, and it prevents them from entering into harmful actions. Now, of course, this is the spread of goods, where we would see economic distribution and fair distribution of the wealth upon the earth, something which in today's modernistic capitalistic system is just completely evil, and we see that it's put people into modern day debt slavery. But this, again, is all secondary when it comes to the issue of these arguments. Because the issue of these arguments is, what it boils down to is really this. Atheists will depend upon two different types of arguments: rational or moral. So that is to say, they'll either point out rational problems of religion or they'll point out moral problems of religion. But the problem is, when you belong to a worldview which can neither account for rationality nor account for objective morality, then essentially what you have to do is you have to borrow from your opponent's worldview in order to even argue with it. Now, what I would say is the very fact that they see and have such issues with moral obscenities, the very fact that evil and suffering are such a big problem for the atheist, should really cause the atheist to wake up and realize that his worldview is wrong, because if atheism is true, then you shouldn't even feel problematic about the amount of suffering we see. Why? Because a baby is nothing more than essentially a piece of cosmic broccoli. And I know that there's some atheists that will really think I'm reducing this to the max, but we saw earlier on that Alex Rosenberg believes that there's no such thing as free will, for example. He believes that there's no such thing as good and bad. Well, if that's the case, why do you moan about all the suffering in the world? Why is it your inside, your fitra, your natural disposition, feels so outraged about the moral imbalance that we see in certain societies? Why is it that you feel that human life does have intrinsic value? Because to be fair, on atheism, again, human life doesn't really make much of a difference from animal life. Which shouldn't really make a difference from plant life, to be honest with you. We're all from the same ancestor, according to this blind, unguided evolution theory. So, why is it that they have placed this special privilege within human beings? I would argue it's because deep down in their hearts, within their fitra, they know that human beings are special, they're cut above the rest, and that Allah Azza wa Jal has a specific purpose for us, and that each one of us is valuable in the eyes of Allah Azza wa Jal.
Absolutely. And one thing before concluding this discussion, I wanted to mention, which hasn't been brought up before. Do you believe evil can be a good thing? As in, the way I perceive it is, without the existence of evil, would we be able to appreciate the good that we have?
Suffering, yes, absolutely. And so, I think I've been in numerous cases in my life where, say for example, I've been stubborn in a certain set of behaviors, and I would take something so amazing that I had in my life for granted during that period of time, in my arrogance, in my stubbornness. And it's only when you actually reach, unfortunately, that point where you realize that, oh, wow, it's too late now. Like, as a result of my stubbornness, arrogance, and this behavior, I'm going to lose that thing. That you realize that, wow, I really did have it good. And I do think that sometimes we do need suffering in our lives in order to appreciate what we have on the table. Sometimes I find that those who have, for example, children in their families who are disabled, it's them who can appreciate the mercy of fully functioning body organs and a fully functioning mind and the ability to communicate better than anyone else, because they know what it's like to look after someone that doesn't have those things on the apparent. And so, absolutely, I do think that through suffering we can learn to pick ourselves back up. And I know this is a popular motif in many movies today and in many novels.
Yeah.
You have that hero motif of a person who starts off as quite a weak individual, and through a large amount of suffering they build themselves up into the individual that they need to be and that they could have been. Without that suffering they could have never got there. So what I would say is that we ask Allah Azza wa Jal to, of course, prevent us from having to experience such drastic suffering. But then at the same time we ask Allah Azza wa Jal, if the only way I'm going to get closer to you is through such suffering, then inshallah ta'ala we're more than willing to accept it. And I know that sounds problematic, but don't forget that we follow, inshallah ta'ala, 14 individuals who I think more than anyone knew the meaning of suffering and what it was like to suffer.
Absolutely.
Those are my 2 cents.
And I believe you've concluded on a very lovely note, and I myself am grateful that we were able to extend this discussion for another episode. Again, I'm also extremely grateful for your time, Shaykhna. Thank you very much for joining us. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.